Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Hello, welcome back. We are so thankful that you have joined us for another episode of You Are From God. We today are going to continue our series on seeing God's image in our relationships. We've looked so far at God's image in our marriages and in our spouse. Last time we looked at the godly image we can find in our homes, specifically how children can see God's image in their parents and how parents need to see God's image in their children. And today we're going to expand that idea to another section that the scriptures usually follow up after they've talked about parents and children, which is the idea of servants and masters, seeing God's image in the leadership of your life. Now, Scott, it's important, I think, at the beginning of this episode to just make it very clear. When the Bible's referring to servants and masters, this is a setup that we don't typically see very much, if at all, today, especially in 21st century America. So we can make some comparisons, but nothing's going to be a strict apples-to-apples comparison, not even just culturally, which we can certainly talk about, but also just the exact setup. So a lot of times you'll hear preachers and people teaching this from the scriptures and talking about it as an employer and an employee, and we can certainly make that comparison and make the application of these verses there. We also can see it in the idea of anybody who is in a position above me. So if I'm on a sports team and there's a coach or somebody who's in charge of the team, a manager, we can think about this being in a classroom. And if there is a teacher, I am submissive to that teacher, or an instructor learning any sort of skill. That's all under this umbrella of understanding God's put certain people in positions of authority or leadership, and it's all to help us understand His authority in some regard. Certainly we can think of lots of examples where people will perhaps abuse the authority they're given or not be good leaders, and we can certainly think of situations where people aren't good followers. But those aren't what we want to focus on today. This is what the scriptures will talk about when it comes to what these servants and masters are really supposed to be doing, and this is where we start seeing God's image. Whether we are leading or following in these relationships, we have an opportunity to demonstrate Christ to the other party and also to see Christ in that other person.
It is such an amazing thing to consider how God, throughout all of our relationships, it comes down to our love for Him. And every relationship that we have is an opportunity for us to glorify God, whether it's a good relationship or whether there's some issues that are going on, and how we're treating other people it's so amazing to read the scriptures about this subject, because it's not really necessarily about that relationship with the other person or who they are. It's going to be about God. And that's what I love about these verses. So Ephesians, the 6th chapter, Tyler, we'll talk about, we read some of these other ones talking about the marriage and children, as you said, but picking up in verse 5, it says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service as to the Lord, and not to people, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, he will receive this back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters do the same thing to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him." Tyler, this is so amazing to even just consider how often he'll say "as to the Lord" or "to the Lord," that idea of that's always the primary relationship that we are trying to preserve, that we're trying to show others that they can have as well, even in the midst of bad situations and bad circumstances. There were and are people that are in leadership roles that are just bad. They're not nice. There's various reasons as to why they're doing that. But it doesn't open up an opportunity for me to act any differently because of the circumstances I find myself in. God still wants me to let His light shine, still wants me to make sure that I'm not doing things because I'm trying to be a people pleaser, but because I'm a child of God. And if we have that perspective, it just changes how we go through life, and it changes how we view leadership, and it changes how we view the things that we may be asked to do or told to do in those different relationships that we're in. And also the other side is true as well in verse 9. It's not the fact that I'm able to tell other people what to do and they need to listen to me kind of perspective. Even as the master, even those in leadership, we need to do those things because we are pleasing God or we're striving to please Him. And sometimes, Tyler, on a day-to-day basis, that can be kind of something we kind of forget from time to time. And that's what I think is so important about looking at these verses, just to remind ourselves this has always been about my relationship with Him.
Yeah, and I think that's really the key piece of understanding. A lot of times, more often than not, we're going to be in this servant role or the student role, the person who's following the leader, right? And understanding that there's going to be times where the person makes mistakes. They're another human. Whether they're following God or not really is besides the point. You want them to follow God. You can help them to know who God is and to follow Him. But I think it's fascinating that Peter will bring this topic up, and in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, he just says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust.
Mm-hmm.
For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly." So he's making the point that you are still shining a light, you are still bearing the image of God, especially, and he goes on here to talk about Jesus. He says, you know who you're like when you have masters on earth that treat you unfairly, that are taking advantage of you, that aren't giving you kindness and consideration for your needs and your things. That's like Jesus. He was mistreated. And so it's this awesome idea that we can still demonstrate Christ even if things aren't going our way. Colossians is another place where Paul will bring up this two-sided relationship and point to both needing to be like one another in the sense that we're mindful of our one ultimate Lord, our master, if you will, that's who we're all striving to follow. Colossians 3:22 says, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." I love the end of chapter 3 there in verse 25 with Colossians, because sometimes we worry, well, if somebody's taking advantage of me, where's the justice?
Right.
And we say, and we understand from the scriptures that God is a God of justice. We see other places like in Romans that'll say, give place to vengeance, to wrath. God's going to take care of those things. It's not your job to get even, so to speak. But Colossians 3:25 just makes it kind of clear that if you've got unfair masters or they're abusing you or taking advantage of you or not treating you well, the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, whether he's a servant or whether he's a master. And that's that no partiality piece that came up in Ephesians and he repeats here in Colossians. So it's just so important to see God at work in these relationships. Even if we want them to be better, it starts being better by us focusing on the image of God and us in that role. If I am a servant or a follower in these relationships, I need to be more like Christ. I can be striving to serve God. I can be shining this light. If I'm in a leadership position and I've got people who are following me and they're struggling to listen, or I'm burdened by the way that they're behaving, I can demonstrate servant leadership to them. I can show them that, listen, I'm striving to serve a leader as well, and he is the leader of all of us, and that's who I want all of us to be following. And so no matter where we fall on the spectrum of whether we're following or leading in any number of different roles as we've talked about, this all comes back to knowing that we have a master in heaven. We are doing everything we're doing to serve the Lord and not for men. Everything we do is about rendering service and giving glory to God, no matter what relationship that is. And that's what I really love about how Titus, Paul writing to Titus, that is, talks about this from the bondservant perspective. The way that he describes it, I think, is just beautiful. In Titus 2:9 and 10, Paul here writes, "Bondservants are to be submissive to their own masters in everything. They are to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, not pilfering, but showing all good faith, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God our Savior." I just love that phrase that servants are going to adorn the doctrine of the gospel because of the way they behave, of their attitude, that they are well-pleasing, that they're not argumentative, that they are showing their faith in God and showing that respect and that care and that love in every situation that we're in. And that's adorning. It's bringing attention to, it's making it very clear that the doctrine of God is beautiful and something that is worth following.
The hardest part, Tyler, is that we get caught up in this "it's not fair" perspective. And you've heard it, I've heard it, I've thought it. It's just not fair what things we're going through. And the interesting part about that is what that does is it makes me the focal point. And the danger with that is that we miss the opportunity to let other people see God. And so in both of the passages that we just looked at or that you had brought up prior to Colossians, so in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, he brings up the fact you need to honor the king. Well, who is the king then? Nero. You think about that standpoint, Peter's writing about the one who's ultimately, tradition says, kills him. And then you get into Titus, the 2nd chapter, and it continues on in verse 11, says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all people." And then he wants us to, why should I act or be willing to go through various trials and various things? Because I want them to see God. It's his grace. It's his salvation that he is bringing to all people. And I don't want to be a stumbling block in those situations simply because I think that maybe something isn't fair or how I view myself to be bigger than I really am rather than people being able to see God. And this can happen in churches. And that's the dangerous part when you talk about a leadership in a church, when you talk about elders. There's a correct manner in how we're supposed to do this, where it's about serving the shepherd when we're serving God. And it's not about me trying to get my way because this is the way that I like things to be, but it's actually with the attitude of love, and it's the attitude and desire to please my God. And the scriptures will talk about this pretty often. 1 Peter, the 5th chapter, at least for me, is the place to start with this one, where he tells us kind of the opposite. This is what we need to be careful of. It says, "Therefore I urge elders among you as your fellow elder and witnesses of the sufferings of Christ, and one who is also a fellow partaker of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not with greed, but with eagerness, nor yet as domineering over those assigned to your care, but by proving to be examples to the flock." And then obviously the great chief shepherd is brought up. But I just like the way that that's worded in the New American Standard 2020. You're the example to the flock. It's not I'm telling the other sheep what they need to be doing. I'm showing them what they need to be doing. I'm leading them. I'm guiding them. And that's the attitude that we see with Jesus, and it certainly is the attitude he calls us to have as well when we're striving to be an influence on other people, even in the midst of a congregation, as an example, let alone outside in the world when we're trying to shine our lights as well. All of these things, whether we're talking about in the church or whether we're talking about in our homes, whether we're talking about in the world, comes down to my relationship with God and allowing other people to see him.
I love that Peter goes on in verse 5 and makes it clear that, again, this is different based on our roles and where we find ourselves, whether we're the teacher or the student, whether we are the coach or the player, whether we are the boss or the employee, however we break that down. Verse 5 just says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. We all need to be humble. We all need to understand that there's a role here, and that God is probably teaching us something about authority through these relationships, and appreciating his perfect, unerring authority is something that we can always take away from that. And that's the point of looking at it in his church, when he is very clear this is how the organization is set up. There are leaders that he's put in place in local congregations, as the scriptures will spell out, and it's ultimately to the point of 1 Peter 5, drawing us closer to God, shepherding us so that we're following the Lord. Hebrews 13 is another place that'll talk about just the leadership of the Christians at this time. Verse 7 of Hebrews 13 simply says, "Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." So there's something there that's worth looking at and copying, in the sense of I'm going to imitate their faith. You jump down to verse 17 and he brings it up again. "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." So again, it's this idea of like, I have to be this leader position, or I have to follow this person. That's not what it should be about. If we are looking for the image of God in these relationships, whether it's in the church or out in the world in these worldly arrangements, it all comes down to understanding that there is joy to be found, that it's easy to groan. We could easily find reasons to groan in a master-servant relationship like the scriptures talk about here. But God is calling us to this higher standard, and the only way that we can find the joy in that and pursue it even when the relationship is bad is when we're focused on God's involvement, that his hand is there, and that we can be like him. So as you're thinking about how to bring these verses and the teaching of the scriptures home with this one, as you look for God's image in the leadership of your life, whether it's people that you are following or whether it's people that are following you, understand the immense blessing that God has given to you to shine for him in those roles. Appreciate the image of God that is at work in you in those roles, and take some time to slow down and think about what God's trying to teach you, what God's trying to show you in that other person, in those other people who are in this relationship with you. Because we all have a part to play, and when our eyes are truly open to the reality of things, we can see that we all are from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.